The last train. In a small northern town, there was an old railway station. Long ago, it had been full of life. Dozens of trains passed through it every day. But after a new railway line was built, the station was abandoned. The tracks began to rust. The building slowly fell apart. And eventually people forgot about it. Almost. Because among the locals, a strange legend remained. They said that once a year, on the night of November 1st, a train arrived at the station. The same train that had disappeared many years ago. According to official records in 1958, night train number 27 departed on its usual route. More than 100 passengers were on board, but it never reached its destination. No crash site was ever found, no wreckage, no bodies. The train simply vanished, as if it had disappeared into the night. Most people dismissed the story as an urban legend. That was until 2004. A group of college students decided to investigate the rumors for themselves. They arrived at the abandoned station shortly before midnight. At first, nothing happened. An empty platform, rusting tracks, cold wind, only silence. Then, exactly at midnight, everything changed. A sound echoed from the distance, the metallic rhythm of train wheels, even though no active railway line existed there anymore. The sound grew louder and louder, until a train emerged from the thick fog. It looked old, far too old, as if it had come straight from the 1950s. Dim lights glowed behind its windows. The doors remained closed, and painted on the side of one of the cars was the number 27. The train slowly came to a stop beside the platform. No one stepped off. No one stepped on. The students moved closer, and then they saw the passengers. People sat quietly in their seats. Men in old-fashioned suits. Women dressed in clothing from another era. Children. Elderly passengers. All staring straight ahead. Motionless. Like mannequins. One of the students pointed his flashlight toward the nearest window. And then something strange happened. Several passengers slowly turned their heads toward him at exactly the same time, as if they had heard something or sensed his presence. That was when the students noticed another detail. The windows were covered with condensation, and on every pane of glass were handprints, pressed against the inside. Hundreds of them. As if the passengers had spent years trying to get out. The train remained there for only a few minutes. Then a long whistle echoed through the night. The doors never opened. The train began to move, slowly disappearing back into the fog, just as suddenly as it had appeared. The students were convinced they had captured something extraordinary. But when they reviewed their recordings the next morning, they found something impossible. The cameras had recorded the platform, the tracks, the fog, and their own reactions. But the train itself wasn't there. Not in a single frame. It was as if it had never existed at all. Months passed. The story slowly faded from memory. Each of the students searched for a logical explanation for what they had witnessed. None of them found one. Then one day, one of the students received a letter. There was no return address. Inside was an old train ticket, yellowed with age, for train number 27. It looked as though it had been sitting somewhere for decades. The student turned the ticket over and looked at the departure date, October 31st, 1958, the exact night the train disappeared without a trace. Mine number 14. In 1963, a massive collapse occurred at mine number 14, one of the worst mining disasters in the region's history. On that day, 23 miners were underground. The collapse happened deep beneath the surface. Rescue teams arrived a few hours later. They worked for nearly 2 weeks, but they never found anyone, no bodies, no survivors, as if the people had simply vanished. Soon after, the mine was declared too dangerous. All entrances were sealed with concrete, and the mine was permanently closed. At least that was the official record. Decades passed, but residents of the nearby settlement began noticing strange things. Exactly at 2:14 a.m., sounds could be heard coming from the old mine. Dull metal impacts, the screeching of carts, the rhythm of pickaxes striking stone, as if someone was still working deep underground, every night, at the same exact time. Most people dismissed it as rumors. Until in 1998, a group of engineers received permission to inspect the old tunnels. They were meant to assess geological stability before a new road construction. The job seemed routine, but on the very first day, strange things began to happen. Some tunnels looked as if they had been recently used. There was no dust on the ground, no rust on the rails, and fresh tool marks were visible on the walls, as if the miners had left only hours ago. On the second day, the engineers found an old mining lamp. It was sitting on a wooden crate, and it was still lit, a dim yellow glow, despite the fact that the mine had been closed for over 30 years. The deeper they went, the stronger the feeling became that someone was watching them. Occasionally, silhouettes flickered in the distance, but every time the corridor turned out to be empty. On the third day, the team discovered a metal door. According to all official mine maps, it did not exist. Behind it was a tunnel, completely intact, without a single trace of collapse, as if the disaster had never happened. The engineers decided to continue. A few minutes later, they heard sounds, voices, the clanging of tools, laughter, the normal sounds of a working shift. Somewhere ahead, they turned off their flashlights and listened. The sounds were real. Someone was actually inside the tunnel. Proceeding carefully, they entered a large underground chamber and froze. In front of them, the mine was fully operational. Lights were on. Carts were moving. People were working. Dozens of them. At first glance, everything looked normal, until one of the engineers looked at their clothing. It was a 1963-era uniform, exactly the same as in the archive photos of the missing shift. Then one of the miners raised his head, looked directly at them, smiled, and waved, as if he'd been waiting for them all along. The engineers ran back in panic. They didn't stop until they reached the exit. When authorities sent another team days later to verify the report, the tunnel no longer existed. Behind the metal door was only solid rock. No passage, no people, no working mine. But the strangest discovery came later, when the engineers reviewed the photographs taken that day. One image clearly showed the underground chamber, working miners, carts, lights. Everything was visible, and in the corner of the photo stood a man. He was looking directly into the camera. On his helmet was a number, 14. The same number belonged to the foreman of the shift that disappeared during the 1963 collapse. Beneath the photo, a note was later found, appearing from nowhere. Just 4 words: "The shift is not over yet." Deep within the forest, far from any major city, stands an abandoned summer camp known as Camp Cedar. Today, very few people know it exists. It doesn't appear on tourist maps, and locals avoid mentioning it altogether. Officially, The camp was shut down in the late 1980s following a tragic incident. But authorities never explained what had happened. Documents disappeared from the archives. Reports were sealed. And everyone who worked at the camp that summer refused to talk about it. Still, the local residents tell a different story. That summer, more than 100 children were staying at Camp Cedar. At first, everything seemed normal. There were games during the day, sports competitions, and campfire gatherings at night. Nothing suggested that anything was wrong. Then one night, everything changed. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, the counselors were awakened by the sound of the camp bugle. It made no sense. Wake-up call wasn't until sunrise. At first, they assumed it was a prank. But when they stepped outside, they saw something terrifying. The children were standing in the middle of the camp square, barefoot, still wearing their pajamas, silently facing the forest. No one spoke. No one moved. The counselors called out to them. They asked what was happening, but the children didn't respond. Then, every child slowly turned toward the trees and began walking into the forest, calmly, silently, as if something was calling them. The staff rushed after them, but the darkness of the forest quickly separated everyone. They could hear footsteps, branches snapping, children laughing, and voices. But no one could understand what the voices were saying. By sunrise, the search had come to an end. Some children were eventually found, terrified, unable to remember what had happened. But many others vanished without a trace. No one knows exactly how many children disappeared that night. Some say 7, others insist it was more than 30. There are no official records. Soon after, Camp Cedar was permanently closed. Years passed. The cabins began to decay. The playgrounds disappeared beneath the weeds. And the forest slowly reclaimed the camp. Yet the place still exists, and the few people who have visited it since its closure tell the same story. At night, laughter echoes between the abandoned buildings. Sometimes it's running footsteps, sometimes whispers, as if children are still playing there. But there's one detail that everyone agrees on. No one can understand what the voices are saying. The words sound distorted, as if they are coming from beneath deep water. Some claim that if you listen long enough, you'll hear your own name among the voices, followed by a quiet plea, asking you to help them find their way home. The locals avoid the forest surrounding Camp Cedar, not because of wild animals and not because of the abandoned buildings. They say they aren't afraid of the dead, because the dead are supposed to remain silent. But at Camp Cedar, the children still laugh, and what they fear most is the day they hear the voice of their own child among them. Horizon Facility. Deep in the northern wilderness lies an abandoned installation known only by its code name, Horizon. Officially, it does not exist. It appears on no maps, it exists in no public records. Even in restricted archives, only fragments of information remain. According to the surviving documents, the facility was built in the late 1970s as a highly classified communications and surveillance complex. After construction was completed, it operated for only a short time. Then it was shut down and sealed. Since then, the site has remained abandoned for decades, without maintenance, without personnel, without official access. But that is where the strange part begins. A group of researchers interested in abandoned and anomalous locations decided to reach the facility despite its remote location and restricted status. After a long journey through the forest, they finally arrived. And immediately it became clear that the place was not simply abandoned. It seemed frozen in time. The buildings were still standing, but heavily deteriorated. The metal structures were covered in deep rust. The windows had long been shattered. Inside lay thick layers of dust and signs of decades of neglect. Yet something felt wrong. There were no signs of gradual decay. Instead, it looked as though everything had stopped at a single moment, as if the entire facility had simply been switched off. The researchers began their survey. Inside the control room, they discovered old shift logs. The final entries appeared routine: equipment inspections, communication line tests, signal monitoring reports. But near the end, the entries became repetitive. The same sentence appeared again and again. The signal has returned. No explanation, no context, just repetition. The final entry was barely legible, as though it had been written in a hurry. "It is not our signal." The journal ended there. The facility should not have had power. Every system had supposedly been disconnected decades earlier. Yet when the researchers entered the central operations hall, they found equipment that appeared to be active. Not fully operational, but active enough to suggest that something was still running. One device emitted a slow green blink, a weak indicator light, as if the system had never completely shut down. Then a sound came from the speakers. Not a voice. At first it was only noise, deep, unstable, like distant radio interference. But gradually the noise began to form patterns, and within it emerged something resembling speech. The voice sounded distorted, too slow, too steady, as though it was not being spoken live. The researchers began recording, and then they noticed something unusual. The sound never became louder or quieter. It simply existed, as though its source was neither inside nor outside the building. After several seconds, the noise abruptly stopped. Silence filled the room. Then the speaker activated once more. A short transmission, a clear phrase: "The facility is still active." A pause. Then a second sentence, quieter than the first. "Why did you come here?" But that was not the most troubling part. The real mystery is that Horizon has officially been considered abandoned for decades, and no record has ever documented its reactivation, or even confirmed that it was ever completely shut down at all. Many years ago, a small village stood in a remote mountain valley. It was a quiet place, known for its old stone church and the large bell that rang across the hills every morning. Then everything changed. After weeks of relentless rain, disaster struck. A dam upstream collapsed during the night. The flood came so quickly that many residents never had a chance to escape. By sunrise, the entire village had disappeared beneath the water. Some claimed that lights were still glowing in the windows as the last rooftops vanished below the surface. Over time, the valley became a lake, calm, beautiful, and far too quiet. But the locals always avoided it, not because of the flood, because of the bell. Every winter, when the ice covering the lake became thin, people heard it. A distant bell, deep, muffled, as if it wasn't coming from above the water, but from somewhere beneath it. Many people tried to explain the phenomenon. Scientists visited the lake several times. They studied the acoustics, searched for underwater caves, and investigated every possible source of the sound. They found nothing. Yet the bell continued to ring, year after year. Eventually, a team of experienced divers decided to descend to the deepest part of the lake. They wanted to discover the source of the mysterious ringing once and for all. When they reached the bottom, they saw something impossible. The village was still there, completely intact, not destroyed, not buried beneath mud and debris. It was as if the water had simply forgotten to erase it. The houses still stood where they had always been. The streets were clearly visible, and in the center of the village stood the old church. That was when the divers saw the bell. It still hung from the bell tower, slowly swinging, back and forth, back and forth, even though the water around it remained perfectly still. But that wasn't the strangest thing. The divers noticed movement in the windows of the houses, silhouettes, people, standing inside and watching them, as if the village were still alive. No one moved, no one waved. They simply watched. And the longer the divers stared, the more it felt as though the villagers weren't surprised to see them at all, as if they had been expecting them. When it was finally time to leave, one diver looked back at the church one last time. The bell was still moving, back and forth, without a single current disturbing the water around it. Then he noticed something else. There were no visible sources of light anywhere in the village, yet the windows were glowing from within. A warm, gentle light, as though someone was sitting beside a fireplace in every home, as though life had never stopped there. A few minutes later, the team returned to the surface. No one could explain what they had seen. The cameras captured the church, the houses, the streets. But when the footage was reviewed later, there were no silhouettes in any of the windows, as if they had never been there at all.